Welcome, everyone, to Church History. Thank you so much for being here. Let's say a quick prayer and we'll get into the lecture. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this group of people. Thank you for the beautiful mix of personalities and humor and just all of the fun that is being brought into this place. Thank you so much for your presence here with us. Lord, I pray that you would be the teacher tonight. Lord, I pray that your will would be done in this place. I pray that you would plant seeds and water them and allow them to grow deep. And ultimately, Lord, I pray that everything that comes out of this class is to your glory. I pray that each one of us glorifies your name, lifts your kingdom, and furthers the cause of Christ from going to this class and learning what we have to learn from you. And we ask it all in your name. Amen. Okay, so tonight we didn't really get through the Crusades, partly because I really don't like the Crusades, but I really do need to spend just a little bit more time talking about them very briefly, because this guy is important to talk about, and he's kind of stuck right in the middle of it. So, there were 7 major crusades, but there were lots and lots of minor crusades that went on across if you can't really call it an empire, across the land, right? So, for example, there were a couple of, you can look these up and they're controversial. A lot of times whenever you look up the minor crusades, there is a lot of backpedaling from the very beginning where whoever is talking about it will say, so rumor has it that this happened. And so there's not a lot of, there are actual minor crusades that people are willing to commit to, but the circumstances behind them, exactly how they started and continued and ended, all that stuff is kind of up in the air. The historical record of the minor crusades is more oral than it is written. And so people are less committed to those. Yes, bless you. So an example of a minor crusade, there was talk of let me see if I can find it, because there was actually a name for it. The Crusade of the Children is what I had it under. So this 12-year-old boy started this idea and decided that he was too young to officially join the Crusades, apparently. I don't know what the cutoff age was. Apparently 12 was it. I don't know. And he really, really wanted to be a part of the movement that was happening, but he just wasn't able to do it for whatever reason. So he and a bunch of kids that are about his age, like 8 to 12, 14, somewhere in that, 7, whatever, somewhere in that general area, this big group of kids apparently got together and they took off from their starting point, which I'm not even sure what that is. They took off from their starting point and they began to walk across Europe toward Jerusalem. Because remember that the 2 primary reasons for the Crusades, one was to regain the Holy Land from the Muslims, and the other was that in doing so, we would reunite the Eastern and the Western religious empires, right? Which actually don't really, at this point, the Roman Empire itself is sort of decimated, but nonetheless. So anyway, this group of kids took off across the continent. How they knew where they were going, who knows, whatever. There's a lot of questions in there, so take it for what it's worth. And many of them died as they were going across, from the elements, maybe from wild animals, who knows, just exhaustion and lack of food, lack of water. There's no telling. They had no provisions at all because they weren't getting funded the way that the actual Crusaders are being funded, so, they were pretty much on their own. By the time they did not get to Jerusalem. Apparently they got more to the east, like the Constantinople area, where there was a body of water, where, trading was happening. And they got to where they were going, and instead of being Crusaders, they ended up being sold into slavery by the people that they walked into. They walked into these areas and people took advantage of them and the fact that they were kids and sold them into slavery. That's the story. Is it true? You got me. But that's one of the minor crusades that you can actually find some documentation for. I just don't know that it's really true. Anyway, so there's lots of minor crusades. That's an example of one. You can look those up if you're interested in it. But there are 7 major crusades. Why were the crusades being run or being Why were they happening? One was to regather or reclaim the Holy Land, and in general, that means Jerusalem. Okay, but any land that they felt should be Christian or had been previously Christian or fill in the blank, they would want to take that too. They just want the Muslim influence out of the eastern part of the land. The second reason is, in doing so, because the idea was to reclaim all of that eastern land for Christianity, it would end up reuniting the East and the West. So, all of these crusades were started by a pope. I was in some sort of capacity, or they were influenced by a pope, if not started. So, the first couple of crusades are really, I guess if you want to call them the most important, but they're the strongest crusades, maybe I could say it that way. The rest of them, they just slowly. It's sort of like the crusades started off and they got as far as they were going to go, and then every other crusade after that, it just never gained any steam and really was not very successful. So, in this first crusade, started by Pope Urban II. Lots of stories, lots of detail you can look at online, but the bottom line is that Jerusalem was eventually recaptured. As they came across and down from the north, there were several cities along the way that they laid siege to and came in and took over, and then would move down, lay siege to, go in, take over, move down. So they were moving. Actually, it was a very Roman way of doing things. That's how, if you remember, that's how Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, is the Romans came down from the north and they laid siege. It was a long time. It was a couple of years they laid siege. This siege was, I don't know, 5 days or 10 days. It was very short, but the Muslim armies at this time were not strong enough and not well organized enough to be able to fend off the effects of, first, the siege, so the lack of food and the water and the this and that, on top of the army coming in, right? So Jerusalem was regained at the end of the First Crusade, which was, in essence, one of the goals, right? It didn't do anything to reunite the empire, but it did regain at least it did regain Jerusalem. The Second Crusade, Christianity, so to speak, still has Jerusalem. It's still, doing its thing. Pope Eugenius III started the Second Crusade because there was a specific city that was taken by the Muslims, and this pope said, no, we're not going to have this start again. So he sent the second set of crusaders to retake that city, and they were not very successful. Basically, the Muslim army had learned its lesson from the First Crusade. They were much stronger and much more well organized. They were more ready for battle by the time the Second Crusade came around, and so this second attempt to retake this other city, not Jerusalem, it was still Christian at this time, but this other city, it just didn't work. The Second Crusade was basically a failure. Then the Muslims ended up regaining Jerusalem. They took over again. So the Third Crusade, by Pope Gregory VIII, he set out. This crusade was set out to regain Jerusalem again. And again, this is the same pattern. They're going through, and any place they find that they feel like they need to take over for whatever reason, they do that. They get to Jerusalem, but they are not able to overtake it. Again, the Muslim armies are much stronger and very well organized by this time, and they're not going to have it. So we were not, the armies, one of the reasons, this is me talking, not history, I believe one of the reasons that it was not successful militaristically, if that's the right word, is these people were not military leaders, and they were not real soldiers. These were normal civilians, some not normal civilians, whatever. It's just a hodgepodge of people that wanted these benefits here and there that came together and tried to take over. And a lot of these people were violent, and so the means to take over the city was violent. Like, we're taking the city by violence for Christianity. By the end of this Third Crusade, in general, the administrations, the people, the idea with most people was, we're not going to be able to reclaim the Holy Land by violence. We're not going to be able to reclaim for Christianity all of this space by force, because we've been trying to do it for several years, and it really just hasn't worked out for us. So this idea of not necessarily no violence, but a spiritual aspect to how we fight our battles began to sort of rear its head, but it never really took hold either. So in this third crusade, there were some minor gains, some other cities that had been taken or whatever, but in general, because Jerusalem wasn't taken back, it was basically a failure. All right, so after this third crusade, a man was put into office, into the papacy, and his name was Pope Innocent III. He was the first man put into this position who was not a monk. He was not brought up in any monasteries, or he had his education, for what it's worth, was not in the things of spiritual matters. He was a canon lawyer. So his upbringing educationally was in the law. And so what he was interested in whenever he took office was not so much the church's priority being taking care of the people, having an attitude of love, making sure everyone's taken care of, blah, blah, blah. That was not really his forefront. His strength was, this is the law, this is how it works, this is how you follow it, and this is the consequence if you don't. And if this isn't working the way I like it, this is the law for that. Do you know? I mean, that was his mindset. And it's pretty easy to understand where he'd come from. You have to work from your background. He's not going to be able to behave like a monk whenever he's a lawyer, right? So he comes in, and the first elected pope that was not a monk, he was a lawyer. So in general, he favored the law over love, or over the things that are spiritual. He began to enforce the idea or the understanding that papal authority was greater than any other authority. So you pick your battle. You can talk about it over the civil authorities. He felt that the church was over the state. If you're talking about within, for example, the papal states, all of the different administrators in the different churches around the papal states, he was the Pope's office, the Pope himself. He is an authority over all of those people. Like, his big push was the elevation of the title of Pope. Okay? So he wanted, basically what he was saying is, papal authority is above all else. And that was his push. So just imagine, as the people, you have grown up all your life, all your generations, with someone who has a spiritual background, who is electing people in his cabinet or around him who are other monks, and when you go and talk to your advisor, that gets to the Pope, and the Pope listens, and something hopefully happens, right? Like, he's there to try to make sure that food is being distributed properly, and that, whatever, right? He's there for the people. The church is there for the people. This lawyer comes in and he changes things a little bit. Not that he doesn't care about the people. I mean, he needs to have people to rule over. Otherwise, how much fun is it to be on an island and be the ruler? There's no fun there. So he cares about the people in as much as that he wants them to do what he says, right? So you can imagine that the people in general, when they start listening to what he's saying and they get the feel for what he's doing, people were, what is Pope Innocent doing? What is all this that's going on? And there started to be questioning, does everybody else feel weird about what's happening right here? So he was very successful in enforcing all the things that he wanted to enforce. And it's because he used two tools primarily to force or leverage his hand. One was excommunication. He did not invent it. Excommunication already existed. We talked about that earlier, where people would be put out of the church and unable to be in fellowship and be baptized, participate in communion. So excommunication was not something that he came up with. The interdict, on the other hand, many credit him with the concept of the interdict. So both of these are concepts of excommunication from the church, or forced removal from the church. Excommunication is the forced removal of an individual from the church, while an interdict is the forced removal of an entire country from the church. So this is what would happen. He'd get, for example, he would try to pass some law. Let's just use money. Let's just say, this is totally made up. This is not a real example. But let's just say that he comes to this church and talks to the priest who's in charge, or maybe a monastery, talks to the abbot, right, whoever's in charge, and he says, you have been paying 1% taxes on everything. I'm making all this up. You've been paying 1% taxes. Now you need to pay 2%. Okay, so the abbot or the priest or whoever he's talking to is knowing his own thing, looking at his coffers and saying, we can't afford 2%. We do 2% and we can no longer provide for the people. We can no longer, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it was greed, maybe it was real, whatever. But the idea is that they say, no, we can't do that. All right, you're excommunicated. Oh, okay, well, we'll figure it out. He totally just leveraged it every time. If you didn't do, as an individual, if you didn't do what he said, then you're excommunicated. Well, as he was elevating his authority and not just dealing with the papal states or the general people, he started dealing with emperors or big leaders, right? People who were truly in charge of large pieces of land, lots of people, right? And now remember at this time, or I haven't told you this, but if you do not know, at this time, the countries like Europe and France and Germany, they aren't actually officially formed yet. Okay, they're kind of becoming formed, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in this class, but there is no Germany, there is no England, there is no France, but there are these people groups, and there are people over these people groups, and we're using the current names for that geography just so you have something in your head. So let's just say that Pope Innocent III, let's use taxes again. He's over, let's just say he's over the authority of England. It's close to Italy. Okay, so England. He says, okay, England, ruler of England, I now want you to pay 5% taxes instead of 4% taxes. Or let's make it even better. I want you to pay 5% when you were paying 2.5%. I'm doubling your taxes to the church. Okay, so here you go. So this king, who is not a priest, right? Not a priest. Probably not even religious at all, secular, looks at Innocent and says, I'm not paying you 5%. You have flat out lost your mind. That's so cute. I'm so totally not going to do that, right? So he's just like, whatever. So he says, all right, you're excommunicated. Well, what do you think the answer from this king is? So, he doesn't care. He has no belief system that has anything to do with baptism, communion, heaven, hell, whatever, right? Whatever. So he's like, okay, I'll take your excommunication, still not paying you your 5%. But here's your 2.5% that we have agreement with, right? Enter the idea of the interdict. So now Innocent, who, again, elevated papal authority, right? He is the grand poobah. Did you guys watch Happy Days? Or anybody old enough to have watched Happy Days or did? Anyway, the grand poobah of the church says, all right, you don't care that you're excommunicated? You and everyone you rule over is now excommunicated. Nobody in all of England can take communion. All of you are going to hell. And again, the king says, okay, I'm good with that. But what do you think the people of the church, the different churches that have popped up, or the monasteries and whatever, what do you think they did when they found out that they were excommunicated? All the funding from the papacy was cut off. They were no longer allowed to take communion. They were no longer allowed to fellowship. Everything was cut off. What do you think they did? They totally freaked out. And here comes the onslaught onto the king. Here comes the pressure onto the king. And the king is like, you guys are so whacked. Like, what is everybody flipping out about? But that is a lot of pressure. Because remember, religion was still really strong in these days. Like, if you did that today, literally most of the country would be like, whatever, right? But then it was a big deal. So now he has all the people coming against him saying, do what he says, give him the 5%, raise our taxes, do whatever you have to do. And so the king is like, oh my gosh, you guys are freaking out. So there's all this pressure that comes from the people. The king succumbs to Innocent and says, fine, we will pay you the 5%. And he says, okay, it's lifted. Everyone can go to church again. And so he was using these two tools as leverage over anybody, anywhere, when he was not getting what he felt was appropriate, either for himself or the church, whatever. I mean, put it however you want. Some of it was probably selfish. Some of it was probably for the church, so to speak. But he used these two tools, and he was really heavy-handed with them. Yes?
Isn't he the one with the crown with all those rubies or whatever it was?
I don't know. I would have to look it up. It could be. It could be. It could be.
Jewels, and I think it was him.
Oh, from the book. Oh, yes, yes. Okay, yes. So, this is how he started to rule the land. Very different from the way that the popes previously to him had been ruling. Okay. So then you have the 4th through the 6th Crusades. He actually began the 4th Crusade, and 2 other people did the 5th and the 6th. It doesn't matter. None of this really matters. I mean, if you want to remember, Urban did number 1 and actually regained Jerusalem. Those are good facts. Those are good, like, bonus question facts. But you don't have to really remember too much about all this other stuff, except that the 4th through the 6th Crusades, there was nothing of significance gained from them. Minor victories here and there, but nothing of significance. By the 7th Crusade, there was so much of the state in the church that it was less about let's retake the Holy Land, let's reclaim the Holy Land for God, and it was more, if you're not going to be a Christian, I'm going to put that in air quotes, if you're not going to be like us, we're going to wipe you out. With the Muslims being in the main part of the target, but anybody. And already the Jews had been very heavily persecuted and treated very badly throughout all the Crusades. So it became less about the church and more about just, you're either Christian or you're out of here, right? Turn, or literally, you burn. So the seventh Crusade was really, it was just a failure. So out of these 7 major crusades, even though Jerusalem was regained for a period of time after the First Crusade, the overall analysis of the Crusades, especially if you think of it in the light of regathering the Holy Land and therefore reuniting the churches in the East and the West, all of these crusades were a total failure. The entire time frame was nothing but violence and death and failure. And what was gained was a huge black mark on Christianity, both by secular people, the Jews, and the Muslims. And remember, I read that little bit to you last week where this was written. This came out of a Jewish-based website, and when they talked about the Muslims reconquering Jerusalem, they said, the Muslims conquered Israel and Jerusalem. Though they allowed Jews to move back into Jerusalem, they also built their mosques atop Judaism's holy site, the Temple Mount. So what they're focusing on here is they've desecrated the Temple Mount, right? When they talk about the Christians' return to Jerusalem, they say Christians defeat the Muslims and kill all the Jews in Jerusalem. So this is just one website, and it's just one opinion, so you can't, necessarily mark that to be everybody's opinion. But in general, and I challenge you to do this, Google the Crusades and find, you can tell usually by the URL what the base is, whether it's Jewish-based or Christian-based or secular-based or whatever, Muslim, I mean, whatever. But if you look through and you try to find an overview or a summary of the Crusades, something like that, you will be hard-pressed to find any summary by any person, anywhere ever, that sheds anything but negative light on Christianity from the Crusades. So it's really a dark time in our past. It's something we have to just own and deal with. And I mean, I don't like to talk about it for obvious reasons. It's terrible. But we do have to own it. We can't, pretend it didn't happen. We can't pretend we weren't part of it because we weren't alive then, blah, blah, blah. That's not how it works. So,
Those popes having to answer for that. I mean, to God.
well, yes, answering to, I thought you meant, I was like, nah, they didn't answer to anybody. But yes, that's true. That's true. I mean, that is definitely something that each of them will have to reconcile. That's between them and God. I am very, very glad that I was not a pope at this time. I can tell you that, because I'm sure that because I think that in general, at the beginning especially, the intent was genuine. The intent was, we really need to stop letting another religious affiliation take over what God has given Christianity. We got to stop this. I mean, we're just sitting back and letting it happen. But the problem is, I'm not sure that there was a lot of prayer put into that decision and a lot of prayer put into how to execute that decision. Because, recruiting people who are of violent backgrounds and going so far as to promise them spiritual, like, you're not going to go to hell. Okay. At the time, I would have been one of those people, very likely. I would have been in this position saying, yeah, I've got that authority. God gave me that authority. This is the position I'm in. I grant you will not go to hell if you go on a crusade. I think they believed it. It doesn't mean that they're not going to pay for it. It doesn't mean there's not consequences, but it's a scary idea. So I'm grateful that I wasn't in that position.
So it's the popes that actually started the crusade.
Mm-hmm. They formed it, and it's interesting because the monks, I'm getting ahead of myself now, but the monks and the monkeries that were around strongly supported the Pope. Absolutely supported the Pope 100% in everything that was happening right now. No matter what it was, 100% followed. And it's part of the reason that the church survived through the Crusades and even past that, but we're only at the Crusades. The monkeries are the reason that so many of our literature and our even as we get into the Renaissance period in a little bit, the art and all of the things that were kind of worldly, it was maintained and preserved in the monkeries, because even the incoming peoples, unless they were like vandals or whatever, the incoming peoples would very rarely desecrate the church. They would kind of leave that to itself. They would leave the monks out, on their own to do their own thing, but they would take the cities and they would take the governments and they would take the churches in the cities. But these outskirt places were reserves for the scriptures. They were being copied, they were being studied, they were being learned. And all these things were preserved throughout all of these times when things were being ignored and violated and destroyed. So the point is, those abbots and the monks that were underneath them, they were in absolute solidarity with the Pope. So but those were also, they weren't the ones going on the crusades. Sometimes they were, but they weren't really the primary people going on the crusades. They were teaching. If there were university style things happening, the monks were the teachers. If there was any sort of party that was going to represent the church outside of the main pope, because they were outside of the Crusades for most of it, they were representatives of the church, and they were the keepers of all of this education. And so, getting back to, I don't even know why I started this, because you asked me a question.
Yes, that the popes started. Well, because I've just been thinking of the way that they portray history, is it's always the kings that started all the crusade.
Well,
the Lionheart and
There was this idea of Christendom going on. There was a marriage between the church and the state, absolutely. But these started in France. They started and ended in the area that is now known as France, and it was these popes that really pulled it together. The emperors that were around, they would join, they would help, they would this, they would that, they would lead their own, they would do all this business. They were part of it, but they didn't start it. So, yes. And because they didn't care about the Holy Land. I mean, who knows? I mean, they cared about the land maybe reclaiming the land they cared about, but they didn't care. These were not their reasons for doing it. And there were crusades outside of what the church did too. I mean, just like these minor crusades from, there were crusades outside of these 7. And there could be that some were not even associated with the church into secular crusades.
And so then on the motives, that would be the civil and spiritual?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The civil and the spiritual, that's right. I didn't put these in because of the... And I think that this, when you get back to Grace's comment or her question, I think that this is really, this is just my personal opinion. It means bupkis, but this is actually what I wouldn't want to answer for. It's one thing to pull a bunch of people together and send them out to fight, and some live and some die and blah, blah, blah. But it's something else totally different to tell somebody your soul is forever saved. I say that I have the authority to say that your soul is not going to hell. And because of my position, you're going to believe what I say. That is a scary thing to answer for. So if I had to raise my hand for what I want to answer for, that's not it. I'd rather raise my hand for this than for this. Like gathering people and sending them off to their death is one thing, but playing with their spiritual life and making them believe everything is okay. If you're going out to war, you know that you have a chance of dying. There's no doubt about it. But if you're going out to a spiritual war and you're told the battle is won and you don't have to worry about, you can do anything you want to anybody you want, whatever, it doesn't matter, your soul is safe, you better be careful.
Tell the Muslims for jihad?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that what they tell the Muslims?
Oh, I don't know. Probably so. I actually don't know very much about the Muslim faith. I've never studied it, so I don't know. I'm not comfortable commenting on that. Okay, so that's the Crusades. I just wanted to go through and make sure that we introduced Innocent because he is sort of the beginning of this change in the papacy where the leadership goes from being spiritual to being more secular or more government associated than scripture associated, if that makes any sense. So Innocent is kind of a turning point in the way that the papacy is run. So that leads us to where we should have started tonight, and I have 20 minutes to finish it, so that's cool. Let's see. Okay. And that's not it. I'm sorry, I have to find my notes, you guys, before I can move on. Oh, here they are. Okay, sorry. All right. So tonight, what we're supposed to be talking about is the deterioration or the beginning of the fall, or however you want to say it, of the papacy. And in my personal opinion, it started with Innocent, and it just sort of took its natural progression after he sort of set the stage. But again, that's just, I don't know that historical scholars would agree with that or not. Okay. So the church is still trying to be the spiritual leadership of the people, whatever that means at this time, okay? So the church began to realize in general that heresies were still alive. People were still coming from outside the church and attacking it, giving these weird theologies and whatever. And bringing, and the consequence of that, like the church in general, if you are just a group of people who says something against the church, it's really of no consequence to the church. But if you're a group of people who go against the theology of the church or the doctrine of the church, and people begin to leave the church and follow that doctrine, then it becomes an issue for the church. And that's what was happening. There were heresies and corruption and just all kinds of different reasons that people were beginning to leave the church. And it was unheard of. I mean, it's one thing for someone to be forcibly removed. It's a completely different concept for someone to say, you know what, never mind, I don't really think I want to do this anymore, and to freely walk out of their own free will. Because then those tools that had been put into place that were still in use, they have no effect anymore. If you don't care about being in the church, excommunication is not a threat, right? So the church realized that they had a problem with heretics and had a problem with heresies, to the point that they were beginning to lose people. People were beginning to leave the church, okay? So the church came up with a 2-part plan to begin to go against these heretics or the heresies, okay? So the first part of their plan is convert the heretic. Do not allow the heretic to say whatever they want to say any longer. It's now time for us to go out, leave the church, and go out and convert the heretic. And the second part of it is for those people who are in the church and for those people who are under the umbrella of the church, it was part of their plan to make sure to protect society. Okay, so this deals with unbelievers, basically, right? And this deals with believers. So the church had taken a stance where they were going to not just take care of the people because they were part of the church, which everybody was at one time. Now they're saying, okay, we're starting to lose numbers, we're starting to have consequences to the heresies that are happening. So now we need to not just protect society and do what we have been doing for the believers. Now we need to make a concerted effort to get those heretics into the church. We need to change their theology. Okay? So, how are they going to execute this plan? So, to convert the heretic, there was a man named Dominic Guzman. Oops. Yes. He is credited with starting the Dominicans. Okay? He was basically the founder, the person who put it together. And these Dominicans were used by the church as what are known as inquisitors. Okay, now we're getting into the term the Inquisition. One of the things that I need to make sure that you know from the very beginning, there are 2 Inquisitions in history. And they're only a couple of hundred years apart, but there's 2 different Inquisitions, okay? One of them is a church-based Inquisition. Well, both of them are church-based, but one of them is confined to the church. The second one is the Inquisition that everyone remembers, where Isabella and Ferdinand got together trying to unite their countries after they got married, and they sent out inquisitors and caused all kinds of issues. That's the big Inquisition that most people have some, at least, recollection of from school or whatever. This Inquisition is minor compared to that. Okay, so just realize that there are 2. There is, I'll give you the names so that you can have the difference. So one of the Inquisitions is called, the Holy Inquisition, which is more what we're talking about here. This time frame is 1206 to 1209, give or take. The other is called the Spanish Inquisition. This is the one that deals with Ferdinand and Isabella. And this was from 1478 to 1834, give or take. Okay? So just realize when we're talking about Inquisition that you have the right, and they're just a couple hundred years apart, so it's easy for them to blend, but just realize that we're not talking about the Spanish Inquisition yet. It does flow into it. What happens here flows into it eventually and influences it, but that's not what we're talking about just yet. Okay? So, 1834. 1478 to 1834.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. All right, so this sort of preemptive or initial Inquisition, it was predominantly led by the Dominicans. They were hired, so to speak, or employed, whatever, sent out by the church. And they had a few, they were actually authorized to do this job via papal bull. So a pope, I think I have it written down, Gregory the IX, he put out an official papal bull from the church that gave the Dominicans the authority to do what I'm about to tell you about, okay? So it was actually an official viewpoint or enforced by the church, okay? So there were a few rules that these guys followed. Rules that began, so when you talk about the Spanish Inquisition, there were lots of rules in place for that too, but they were very loosely followed. But these rules, for the most part, were followed for a time. Okay, so rule number 1 is only question, now this is going to maybe surprise you, only question believers. Are you a Christian? Are you not a Christian? Who is your Savior? Who is your Lord and Savior? It doesn't do any good to question an unbeliever because they're going to say whoever they're going to say or nobody or whatever. But what they're trying to do is protect society. They want to make sure that if you are claiming Christianity, that you really are a Christian and that you're not some heretic out here who's saying whatever it is that you think you need to say so that we'll leave you alone. Okay? So they questioned the people claiming to be Christians. They were the first of the Inquisition. The second rule was questions were used to convert only. Not convict, but convert. So, if you were pulled into an inquisition, it's because you said you're a Christian. Once you were in the Inquisition, the questions that were asked were to verify who you say you are and to, if you are one of those people who is just playing around, to actually get you converted. Okay? Now, this is where things get a little hinky for those of you that watch NCIS. This is where things get hinky. The third rule is, did they say minimal? No, they don't. Torture is allowed per Roman law. Because remember, all of these people, even though it's been a long, long time since the empire has been official, these are still all people and governments and ideals and whatever that have come out of, just like we are a product of Roman law, this country, these people were still a product of the ideas and the understandings and the workings of what used to be called the Roman law. And so, torture was allowed in order to verify this is true or to guarantee that we have a convert. That's where things get weird. Because if you are a Dominican who is very tender-hearted, you have a very soft spirit, then your torture is probably going to be pretty non-existent. Your method to deal with somebody is going to be more love than anything else. But if you happen to be a Dominican who is more militaristic, for whatever reason, this is an avenue for you to legally be able to do whatever it is you want to do. So, in general, things were fairly controlled because ultimately these Dominicans reported back to the Pope, who at this time still had authority. Okay? By the time you get to the Spanish Inquisition and the fact that it wasn't started necessarily by the church, it was endorsed by, but really this was a tool, just like Constantine wanted to use Christianity to bring everybody together. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to use Catholic Christianity or Roman Catholicism to pull their countries together and to get everything in order. And so they were more of a civil government using the church, and this Inquisition was more of a civil Inquisition, even though the church was running it. And so the Spanish Inquisition is full of all kinds of terrible stories, all kinds of things that were going on there that's not good. It's being done by Dominicans, being done by members of the church, so to speak, but it was just much worse. Not that bad things didn't happen during this sort of initial one, they did, but it was to a much lesser degree. Most people don't even realize there were two inquisitions. That's how much less. Do you know what I'm saying? All right. So that was so these Dominicans, these inquisitors, this was their number one way to try to convert the heretic. If you claimed Christianity, you were either telling the truth or you were going to be converted. That was the idea. That's how they were going to try to combat number one. Number two had a little bit of a different, not quite so defined protecting society. So the group of people who was more in charge of protecting society were the Franciscans. Okay? The Franciscans. The monks that were part, and this was established by Francis of Assisi. I'm not sure. That is like that berry. I think I have it written down somewhere. Oh, there it is. Assisi. Okay. So, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, they were unique from all other types of monasteries. They were completely unique from every other kind, the Benedictines and the blah-de-blahs that all came out of it. These two guys, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, were very different from all the other monasteries. But they were distinguishing from each other. In general, the Dominicans, they were much more hard and cold and letter of the law, and this is just what you do. Whereas the Franciscans were a little bit more like, well, let's approach this in a way where people will hear it, understand it, accept it, and actually truly, in spirit and truth, do what they need to do, right? So their approaches were very different. So it makes sense that the harder people, or the colder, if you want to call it that. That sounds derogatory. It's not meant to be, though. These were in charge of dealing with the people who were probably not being authentic. These people were in charge of the group of people that were already in and needed protection. Okay? So the church had this two-part plan and used these two groups of people to try to execute it. All right. These orders, I can give you more information maybe next time. I have a whole list that how they are really different from each other and a couple of ways how they're the same, but I don't want to take the time to do it right now. So these two groups of people, one of the things where they were very in line with each other is they went back to basics. They went back to Scripture, and both groups of people believed that you should live in total poverty, that you should take this oath of poverty and have a lifestyle that is a sacrifice in and of itself. So most of the time, the way that these guys got along, because they weren't necessarily in the outskirts able to work the land and do the things that the other monasteries were doing, they still had to eat, right? And they obviously didn't have a lot of money, right? Because they were living this poor lifestyle. So what they would do, it's a term, It's called mendicants. They were mendicants. What that means is they would go and they would beg for survival. They would go into the cities, into whatever populous area they could find, and they would beg for food, or they would beg for money. I do not know if they begged for work in order to have food. My guess would be yes, but I actually don't remember reading that. I do know they begged for food and money, and they took what they needed, and that's it. Okay? But they had to do it daily, or every other day, or whatever. They had to do it consistently, because that was their only, for many of them, it was their only means of nourishment. So this separated them from most, if not all, of the other types of monasteries, but linked them together, even though they were very different in how they did their things. I don't know that they're necessarily I don't know that they're out begging. I mean, I don't think that's happening anymore, but yes. Yeah, there is some representative of all these monasteries that are still around. All right, so very quickly, maybe not. This is such a good story, but Pastor Anthony has a class. Okay, we will start. This is really a good story. We're going to get back into the intrigue. Like, if I didn't have to go through the Crusades, we totally would have gotten to this. But, so next week we're going to start with this story of the decline of the papacy. And it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. It involves the king of England, and there's this rivalry and this back and forth, and it involves people who is getting put into the title or position of Pope, and how they handle it and what happens, and oh my gosh, it's a big, huge mess. And the whole thing ends with an ecumenical council to try to clean up the mess of the past, 70 or 80 years that starts next week. So it's a really good story. We'll do it that'll be what we start with next time. So Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening. I pray that you will be with each person here. You will carry them safely to their homes and to their families and through the week. And Lord, I pray that you will bless the time that they are willing to give to this class and to the reading and the learning. I pray that you will just solidify what you would have them learn. We ask all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen.